Hello, everyone. This is Joe Arroyo,
And Nate Hitchcock.
and we're with Muffin Express Games, and welcome to the Dev Diary,
Today's topic is why setters and getters are great.
or bad, depending on how you look at them, I suppose. Nate and I are a little torn between this topic. I think we've come to a consensus eventually, but not without great debates.
It's been a bit of a holy war. We've split the team actually. People who think they're bad, which is everybody except for me, and people who think they're good. Perhaps even one of the greatest patterns you can use in programming. I have a ton of stuff we'll talk about. Uh,
Well, I think the big thing about this was coming up from the last game engine that we worked on, where we reached the end of the semester, and it was all about just rapidly iterating. We needed to get things done as quickly as humanly possible, and the act of moving variables to public, just so that we could get over accessing them. Not everything, but towards the end, everything gets
everything.
hacky, and we did that much to Nate's chagrin, so we wanted to come up with a better way around it this time.
My alternative was to just have everything be instead of having public data, just have private data with public getters and setters. And my big vote for this, my big reason behind this was because when you are halfway through some huge system and you have a ton of these public variables, and all of a sudden you want to have some side effect. Like let's say for if you're using like transformations, right, and you have like a position variable, and you also have for some reason another position variable in like a physics body,
We
and
used
you
this.
yeah we used this
It
actually.
was for parallaxing of the background pieces. It was based on juxtaposition to, well, relative to camera space, and we wouldn't have been able to do that if we were just accessing the because we put it in the
Exactly.
getter or in the setter.
I actually, that was one of my first things that I did on this team was I had to go through and replace all of the like public variables for position X and position Y with getters and setters, and it took me like 2 days. It was terrible. So that's my biggest vote for getters and setters.
I get it on that regard, but then lo and behold, a certain little article came up,
Yeah,
and this was on typicalprogrammer.com. You can find it, and it's titled "Doing It Wrong: Getters and Setters." His argument is completely against them
it's
altogether.
well, it's a bit of a treacherous name actually because though he says you may interpret it as getters and setters are bad. It's actually more doing them wrong is bad, which is kind of stupid because I'm pretty sure we can all agree that doing anything wrong is
It's
bad.
bad.
So a lot
I
of
don't
what he
know.
says is just like he did stupid stuff with them, and that's why they're bad. So instead of interpreting this as like as getters and setters are bad themselves, you should probably look at this as you should approach programming uh, by incorporating purpose into everything you do. Don't just have getters and setters to have getters and setters. I wrote a counter article to this article because I disagree with a lot of the stuff he says. And he does a lot of stupid stuff. And we can actually hop over to the Trello page real quick.
Well, one thing real quick to make a note. We'll show that as well. But on here, he makes a good comment. So his main argument that you would see is he basically says, "Well, I wouldn't. The bank wouldn't benefit from giving me a setter and a getter to my bank account because I'd love to put in, like, 1 trillion bazillion
Yeah,
whatever dollars inside my account." So his argument is like, you don't want to have these variables that can just be set. That's the idea. Like, I don't want to just be able to go in and put in anything I want for this variable. Let's say it's a position, and I put in the value of 1 million by 1 million. I mean, yeah, it wouldn't really do much, but giving people the ability to do something like that is what he's claiming is such a bad practice.
right. And my counter argument to that was that instead of giving people just open access with getters and setters, all getters and setters should have some sort of implementation behind them. They shouldn't just be directly getting and setting. You should have stuff like limits. I mean, this is all in an ideal world. Of course, I don't program like this. I know many people don't program like this because it's such a huge hassle, especially when we're wrestling for time. But if you use getters and setters properly, they should always have some sort of extra thing they do, like limiting the amount you can add into a bank account. Or alternatively, you might not need a setter for your bank account money. You might have other functions that impact that, like deposit instead of just set. So there are other functions can implement stuff. These functions could also be thought of like a setter, but aren't necessarily just directly setting.
And that's exactly his point, is that if you make a function like deposit and all it does is really add something to your bank account, then it's better than having a set bank account. But that being said, it's not all that different, especially if there's something that does just set something and there is some variable that you just need to be set. then I guess he's just saying repackage the setter and just name it something different, like adjust.
Yeah, but again, in an ideal world, you would have some kind of limit. Like, I mean, for instance, in my article, I use the example of integer overflow. You never want integer overflow. Well, almost never. I have yet to see an example where I actually desired integer overflow to be a possibility. So instead of having a public variable where you could just set some variable to like 4 billion, whatever, like an int, you set to 4 billion, then add one to. If you had a setter, you could say if this is the max int, then don't add any more to it. Don't let it overflow.
Which is exactly the point. Then there are variables that need to just be set. And just because you rename it doesn't make it any different than being a setter. It's just a setter. At the end
Right.
of the day, I can call
Right.
it adjust, and it still is good. If it's just setting a variable, then it's a setter, right? So at the end of the day, there's this thing where you get to put boundaries on stuff, and you wouldn't get to do that if the variable was just public. So this is the article that Nate wrote up as a rebuttal to this the article that's online right now, and we'll post this underneath the video. So on the website on muffinexpressgames.com, you can actually check out what Nate had to say in more elegant terms. Right? He's
Yeah.
not very
No,
elegant,
I'm not
not
very.
in real life, especially when you meet him.
Well, more than you. But
So you can check out our website again. That's muffinexpressgames.com. We also have a lot of this is our first Dev Diary post. We'll be doing plenty of these screencasts as well. We'll have a Twitch account up, and we'll be doing some live streams for code. We have our art director who does beer pairings. This is
he likes
a
beer.
great little section where he pairs specific types of beer based on their flavor profiles with certain games, and you can come there and check that out. And we'll get back on topic here to wind things down. So again, typicalprogrammer.com if you want to see the site dedicated to telling us why getters and setters are wrong. And then check out our rebuttal as well, or Nate's rebuttal rather.
Yeah.
So I should at least try and defend him on some aspects because we did argue over this for quite a while.
Yeah.
And that is just that there are, I mean, let's say I would argue that there is a variable where all I want to be able to do is adjust it. And our argument is simple. We don't want to have to waste any CPU cycles like going and fetching like an actual function call. I know that that's really minimal, but in terms of a game where let's say you're setting and getting, let's say a vector or something like that, where that's going to happen thousands and thousands and thousands of times, like each game loop, then there's that thing where if I know you can mark it inline, but that doesn't mean that the compiler is really going to do that for you. And so you wonder like how much you might be wasting doing it, especially when the only people working on it are a student project of 4 or 5 people, right? We're the only ones who are using it. If we abuse that setter, or not setter, but if we abuse that variable, it's our own damn fault. Like it's one of those like we're not trying to protect a user with a user interface per se.
I mean, I see what you're saying, and for the desire of time, we often sacrifice proficiency and efficiency,
Elegancy.
elegancy. That's a word. Yeah, but I think that in a perfect that doesn't mean that getters and setters are wrong though. Just because we don't always do them and we can't always do them doesn't mean they're inherently a bad pattern to use. Contrary to, I think that they're actually a very good pattern to use. It's just we don't have the time to always do them. It's like implementing perfect systems. You know, we don't always have the time to think about and to research and to develop the perfect system. At some point, we have to cut it off and say, okay, well now we don't have any more time, we don't have any more money. Let's just move on to the next system. I think getters and setters are a lot like that. Implementing the perfect getter and setter pattern is very very difficult and is very time consuming. And I'm not even sure if it's possible. But I think that the more we try, I mean, just because they're bad doesn't mean we should just ignore them, right? Just because they're not always the best solution doesn't mean that we should just completely cut them out altogether. That's one of the points in this article actually is that he says we should just avoid getters and setters altogether. We should figure out how to just completely avoid them. And that's probably the biggest point I disagree with is because even though we can't always implement the perfect getter and setter, we should still strive to. We should still strive to put enough time and thought into our code to provide these well thought out, well constructed getters and setters instead of exposing public variables. And actually, also in this article, I just want to say this real quick. It's not really super relevant, but he talks about having public variables and setters to those public variables.
Wait, isn't that a setter?
Well, no, he has a setter to a public variable.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that.
So
That's not something
yeah,
I even considered.
no, no, I have no idea what he was doing. He's talking about how in the system he was working in the engine or whatever he was doing, there were public variables, and then they had these functions that would also change these public variables. That alone is
Oh, that's a mess.
terrible because then people don't know which to
Thing to
use. Yeah,
use.
and so maybe you have like some function that has some side effect, like for instance, like our position and parallaxing, like you use set position and it sets the parallaxing layer also. But if you just set the position directly, it doesn't set parallaxing.
Right, so you could
So
have 10 places in code where you did it through the function and 10
yes,
places where you didn't, and you'll spend hours trying to find out where the hell, why isn't the background moving for this thing, but it is for that thing.
yeah, no.
That's
So
horrid.
I think a big problem though with such a huge topic like getters and setters is we often lose track of it. Like it's such a huge topic to talk about that I think in a lot of places his paper, typical programmer's paper, like strays off topic and he talks about silly things that happen that aren't really about getters and setters, like that situation where he has a setter for a public variable. That's a completely different problem. That's
Yeah,
a
let's
completely
not
different
even go down
issue.
that
No, that's wrong,
path.
straight up. But I also my paper I go off on a couple rants that aren't completely relevant. But the big idea I think we can all agree on is that getters, it's not good to just blindly put functions like getters and setters into your code. You should always think about what you're doing. You shouldn't just say, "Oh, I have this private variable. I guess it needs a getter and setter," because it might only need a getter. It might be something that only is modified internally. So you might not need to set it from anything from a public place, right? So you might not need getters and setters, both getters and setters for a variable. You might have special functions that act as getters and setters that aren't directly like just getting and setting, because you really shouldn't ever have just plain old getter and setter functions. There always should be something more you should put into them. Usually, there's always something you can put into them. So
They should be thought out. Like a good example is building the graphics system and stuff. There are a lot of like devices and all sorts of pointers to COM objects for DirectX, and you don't need to get or set them. But there would be a function like, for example, turning anti-aliasing on and off that actually requires you to destroy like two or three items and recreate them. And that's the perfect example. I'm affecting 3 or 4 private members as a result of this function call, but you wouldn't know that on the outside, and that's kind of the whole idea of how to protect your private variables through these function calls that actually have some kind of a meaning behind them.
yeah,
They're performing a task, and that function represents the task that they're performing, and then they happen to be adjusting or mutating these internal variables. So basically, the I mean, in conclusion, if you can stay away from public variables altogether, you should, right?
if you have the time to.
If you have the time to. All that being said, every time you move a variable to private, it should not be your first thought to turn around and write. You shouldn't be like, oh, here's a variable, and now here are my getters and setters, and I'll go on with my day.
Right.
Put them in there, and then consider where they would need to be adjusted and under what context, and then think of a function that might do that, and then go from there. Right? I think that's
Yeah.
like the main way to approach it. And in so many words, that's kind of what he's trying to get at in this article, but he just does it by kind of, taking a dump on getters and setters.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a profusion of getters and setters, like he says in this first paragraph, a profusion of getters and setters is a sign of a poorly designed program, as is a profusion of public variables, or a
That's
profusion
valid.
of anything else. Like I mean, you shouldn't just blindly implement some design paradigm without thinking about the implications for your program, what's best. You should always have thought before you just write stuff.
Yeah, agree. So yeah, stay tuned for more Dev Diary updates. We'll be trying to get one in once a week. We'll talk about various topics. Some of them will be very game design specific. Some of them will be just overall programming practices and patterns and
Yep.
whatnot. Every once in a while, we'll have some posts about just some industry stuff that's going on as well. So some are for bigger nerds than others. I guess it just depends on like this guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, so stay tuned. Come check out some other ones. Make sure to head over to our website, muffinexpressgames.com, and check out the content as it starts flowing. And once again, this is Joe Arroyo,
Nate Hitchcock,
and this has been an episode of the Dev Diary.
stay baked.
See ya.